Hello, brilliant entrepreneur. It's Tash Corbin here, and welcome to another episode of the Heart-Centered Business Podcast. This is episode number 259, and you can find all the relevant links and show notes for today's episode over at tashcorbin.com/259. Today, I'm going to share with you how I create podcasts from idea all the way through to income generation. So if you've been thinking about starting a podcast or you'd like some tips on how to improve your consistency of getting juicy content out to your audience and making sure that it does its job in terms of income generation, then this is going to be a super helpful episode for you. Let's dive on in. I'm Tash Corbin, and this is the Heart-Centered Business Podcast. So this episode, I'm inviting you to come a little bit behind the scenes and see how this podcast happens. Not only how it happens and how I get it all out there, but also how it does its job of income generation for my business. So I'm going to dive into some of the equipment that I use, what I do in terms of idea generation, and how I get my podcast episodes out to the world, as well as how I get them to do their job in terms of income generation in my business as well. Now, before I jump into this episode, if you would like to dive deeper on getting all of your content to do its job, I actually have another podcast episode from a few weeks back that really dove into that a lot deeper, and it talked about the different jobs of content. So your content isn't just about direct sell and income generation. It also has jobs to do in terms of generating reach, allowing you to connect and nurture your audience, and lead generation through to converting people into paying clients. So I do want to recommend that podcast episode for you. If you haven't checked it out, just come on over to today's show notes and I'll make sure that I link it there at tashcorbin.com/259. But today, let's specifically talk about my podcast. I've been doing the Heart-Centered Business Podcast since 2015. Late 2015 is when I started, and it has been such a beautiful and valuable part of my business model. I loved the idea of podcasting at first because of the ability to share onto iTunes and the potential to find new people that I wouldn't normally get in front of through Facebook and other social media strategies. And I also loved the idea of podcasting initially because I had a YouTube channel with video content, but creating those videos felt like it was a bit of a production. I wasn't camera ready all of the time, and I just had so much that I wanted to share with my audience. So I decided to add a podcast. So when I first started the Heart-Centered Business Podcast, it was audio only. And at the same time, I was also still releasing a new video on YouTube every single week. So I was recording a podcast every week and recording a video every week. They were different topics. They would go onto different channels. In 2017, I recognized that I was making it really hard for my audience to get all of the content that I was sharing with the world because I was sharing way too much, and I was scattering people across multiple platforms with multiple pieces of content here and there. I was constantly getting emails and messages from people saying, I remember hearing something from you about increasing my prices, but I've been looking on your YouTube channel and I can't find it. And I'd be like, oh, no, that one's on the podcast. It's not on the YouTube channel. Or sometimes that would be the other way around. And so what I recognized was that I was making it really hard for my audience to keep up with all of the content that I was creating. And I was also making it really hard for myself to be consistent as well. So at the end of 2017, I streamlined everything down. And now what I do is I record a video podcast, and that's shared onto YouTube as a video. But then the audio part of it is shared as my podcast onto iTunes and Spotify and all of those sorts of places. So the podcast has definitely changed and pivoted a lot over the years. When I first started, the big model of podcasting was to have a content upgrade for every episode. So when I did first start the podcast, every episode had a fresh content upgrade, and that was either a template for something or a worksheet or a handout. I blame Amy Porterfield. I love her, but she does this on her podcast, and it was so much work, and my poor team were run ragged trying to create all of these things I had ideas for. And ultimately, what I also did with my audience was I made them content hoarders. So I had people who would send me a list of all of the files that they had downloaded over the years from my podcast and all of the content upgrades that they'd got. And they'd be like, have I got everything? And I would be like, what do you need? I was like, well, it's not about what I need. It's about what you've made. And I wasn't meeting my audience's needs. I was turning them into content hoarders. And I was making it really hard for myself as well. So I no longer do a content upgrade fresh for every single podcast episode. And I think all of my audience breathed a huge sigh of relief when I announced that. And instead, I have a few free things that relate to most of my podcast content. But the call to action on my podcast can be to come and join the conversation in the Heart Centre community. It can be to jump in and buy the 30-day business blast. You might have heard me talk about that on the last couple of episodes. Or it could be to come and grab one of my free trainings. And I think I've got 8 free trainings or resources that I speak about pretty consistently on the podcast. Because at the end of the day, like, I am very niched in where I am focusing my energy and attention and who I'm here to serve and what I'm here to help with. And so I can be really specific with those calls to action and, recruiting people onto my mailing list and connecting with them more and providing more value deeper than the podcast. And I can do that through just having a few things that I refer to more consistently. So, that's been a bit of the journey of the podcast over the years. I definitely go through phases in terms of whether I'm only doing solo shows or I'm also including interviews. You will notice this year there'll be quite a few more interviews coming out on the podcast. In the second half of last year, I got back into doing spotlight interviews on the podcast, and you guys loved it. And I got a lot of feedback from people thanking me for interviewing people or bringing people to their attention, or even they'd been following that person for a long time but never heard them ask the kind of questions that I asked or never heard them talk so candidly about behind the scenes in their business. So I do want to continue doing that with the podcast, especially this year, so that we can really connect in with new people and I can spotlight other people who I really feel like align with the values and the model of business and the type of way that we show up in business that I like to encourage. And so sharing the spotlight with those people and helping you discover other people who also do really great connected business strategy is a big focus of mine for 2021. Other things that have changed a little over the years with the podcast include the length of podcasts that I've been doing. Previously, I was like trying to box myself into the 10-minute episode kind of model. But I know that I dive very deep in the content that I share and the insights that I'm giving. And I want to not just tell you what to do or give you an idea, but I want to explain how I've applied it or how you could, different ways that you could apply it in your own business as well. So I've gone back to allowing myself to speak for as long as I need to speak on podcast episodes. And that has actually improved the listenership rates on the podcast. So I know when I just do what comes naturally to me and I kind of follow my instincts with the podcast, everything seems to go better. Another little thing that I've been playing with recently was I did go to 2 episodes a week towards the end of 2020. My listenership dropped off dramatically. And again, what I could see I was doing was making it hard for people to keep up. So we're now back to weekly episodes and a weekly solo show. And if I do a spotlight interview, it will come out on the same week as a solo show. So that week we'll have 2 episodes, but most weeks we'll just have 1 episode on the podcast to make it easier for people to keep up and stay across all of the things that I'm sharing on the podcast. So when it comes to podcasts and how many episodes you should do or how long the podcast should be or whether you should do interviews or not, whether you should do content upgrades or not, I want you to see I'm a role model for it's totally up to you and play with it and see. I can see on my podcast exactly how many people listen to every episode. I can see on my podcast how many people then come over to the show notes. I can see on my podcast how long people are listening to the podcast, whether they're finishing episodes or not. There's so much amazing and rich data that comes from having a consistent podcast that I think in all cases The best thing you can do is start with what you feel like doing and then see what happens when you make little changes, rather than me saying there's one hard and fast way to do it, because I've definitely experimented with those different things based on what I've seen other podcasters do. And I know in a lot of cases it works for them, but it doesn't always work for my audience, or it doesn't always work for me and what my strengths are. So when you hear me go through how I create podcasts from idea to income generation, I want you to do it through the lens of, this is what Tash has worked out is a good fit for her. And I am in no way saying that you should do exactly the same as me. So let's dive in. And first of all, before I start talking about idea generation and the content in the podcast, I just want to quickly walk you through the equipment that I use. So the microphone that I use is a Razer Siren, and this is an external microphone that connects up to my computer. I only started using this about a year ago. Before that, I used Apple headphones with the built-in microphone. And I say this when people are saying, oh yeah, I want to start a podcast, but I'm saving up for a microphone or whatever it might be, that there is millions and millions and millions of dollars of research that went into those Apple headphones. So start with Apple headphones if that's where you're at. If you've got some and you can get started, that microphone has great excess noise reduction technology. That microphone is really good at creating a clean sound. So you are allowed to just use headphones with a microphone built in. You don't need to have the best of the best equipment. Now, I have had a Blue Yeti microphone and I've had a Rode Lav microphone previously. I didn't like them. Even though you might argue that it was a better sound quality, I didn't like that you could pick up a lot of my mouth sounds with those microphones. And there was another podcast that I listened to and she had a tongue ring, and I could tell you she had a tongue ring just by hearing her on the podcast, and it really grossed me out. And so I have bought and sold those microphones before. Now, those two, I would say, are probably the most widely recommended by podcasters, but I didn't like them. And I just went back to my headphones because the sound that the headphones generated was much more tolerable to me. I think I'm a little sensitive to mouth sounds and juiciness and wetness. I don't know. It's so weird to describe. But I love this microphone now. So I bought this one. It was only $120, this Razer Siren, Raizer. I'll make sure it's in the show notes for you. It was only $120 for the microphone itself. And then this stand, I'm going to move it. Sorry if there's some sound when I do. So it's actually on a desk stand that just slots into a little what is that called? Grip thing. What is that called? I can't remember what it's called. Anyway, it's got a little like thing that's clamp. It clamps onto my desk, and then the microphone holder goes in. The holder itself I bought on Mighty Ape, I think, and it cost me $30. You can get them off Amazon as well. It just means that if the mic bounces, if I touch my desk or something, it moves a little more in a gentler way. There's no rattling of the microphone. And I love that I can bring the microphone nice and close without it actually needing to be sitting on my desk. So that cost me about $30, and that included this beautiful black cover as well, which just softens the sound a little. But I'm not here to say you need the perfect sound for a podcast. I just do it, right? Just if you're going to start a podcast, just start your podcast. You definitely don't need to be investing in all of this equipment. Most people who start a podcast don't like it or don't keep up with it consistently. So you're just going to feel like you've wasted even more money if you start a podcast, you invest in all of this stuff, and you don't end up sticking with it. You don't like that format and it doesn't work for you. So microphone is a Razer Siren, and this is not even a branded microphone holder. It's like literally like no brand name on it. Then in terms of my camera or having that video element to my podcast, I still use the inbuilt camera on my laptop, and I use Photo Booth for Mac. So I have an Apple MacBook Air, but I want to say big caveat on this. I have kept this Apple MacBook Air because it has really good camera quality. But the next model, the latest models, they downgraded the camera quality. So if you have a MacBook Pro or a MacBook Air that is newer than the 2017 one, I think this is, then your camera quality probably doesn't look like what I'm recording now. It's absolutely horrible. And I think it was a huge mistake on Apple's part to downgrade the camera quality on their laptops because so many people do videos and video streaming now. Ridiculous decision. But anyway, if you have that, then I would recommend the Logitech Brio HD. And again, I won't put any affiliate links to this thing or whatever, but the Logitech Brio HD, I have seen before and afters from people who have used that. And I actually have got one that I've ordered back to Australia for when I go back to Australia, because I will be upgrading my computer again when I go back to Australia, and I know it's going to have a terrible camera. So I actually already own one and it's waiting for me at my sister's house in Australia, and it is epic. It is the best of the best. It's amazing. It connects up really easily. It's fairly seamlessly integrated with your computer. So if you are looking for a good quality camera, that would be the one that I recommend. And you can simply just use it with Photo Booth. Now, the other thing that a few people do, which I don't, but you could absolutely do this, is if you want to use Zoom to record video podcasts, you can. And if you haven't checked it out and discovered this yet, when you are using Zoom, go on into the preferences section, click on the video part, and Zoom actually has two really great features. One is you can increase the light manually, so you can lighten it up if you don't have good lighting. So recording your videos in Zoom will allow you to improve the lighting on those videos simply by making adjustments on those preferences. And the other thing that Zoom has is it actually has appearance touch-ups. So it can do that kind of soft filter look for you. I would say don't push it all the way to the end because the very, very touched up side looks a little weird, but you can use both of those features if you record videos in Zoom. Now, I have great lighting and I don't particularly like having the touch up effect. So I just use Photo Booth and I find that's really easy for me. It's really simple and I don't need to be on the internet recording, because when you're on a Zoom call, even if it's just with yourself, you are on the internet. So I don't need to use Zoom to do those videos, but that is a little hack that I've learned from other people over the years, and it's a really good one. Then we have lights. So I have 2 box lights. I bought 2 for $75 off eBay. I'll see if I can grab a link to those and put it on the show notes of today's episode. But if you search for box lights on eBay, you can generally find them pretty reasonably priced, and they all come from the same place, I'm sure. And about $75 for a set of 2 is the best price that I've found, and really affordable to be able to have those. These box lights do take up a little bit of space, so you need to have space in front of you to have those box lights in place. But I love using box lights. I find that the brightness of the light works really well with my backdrop, and I feel like it just does the best job for me. I had a ring light before that, like a little desktop ring light thing that went above and around my computer, but I found that it gave me big white rings in my eyes and I found them really distracting, and I looked a little ghostish, a little zombie-ish in some of my videos, so I didn't really like the ring light effect. So I got rid of the ring light and went for box lights instead. There are companies that also do more expensive and advanced things, like you can get desktop box lights and all sorts of things now, but the price is still quite big on those. They're getting better, but for $75 for 2 box lights, including the globes and everything, I cannot fault them. So box lights for the win for me, but yeah, there are lots of options in terms of lighting. There are times when I don't take my lights with me and I'm recording in other places. I just face a window and make sure there's plenty of natural light coming in. But I do find that the box lights make a really big difference, and they do feel like it's well lit and, just show up a lot brighter on screen. So box lights are my recommendations in terms of lighting. Now, of course, background is important as well. If you're doing videos, if you're doing audio only podcasts, you don't need to worry about that. But if you're doing videos, I do recommend making sure that you pay attention to the background of your videos and just make the background as consistent as possible. You don't need to buy a backdrop. This is a fabric backdrop. So this is from Bespoke Backdrops and was designed by Emma Vega Malta. And this is actually my second of these backdrops. I actually have two of them now. I have one that's more travel ready and I have one that is more a stay-at-home one. And it's the same design on both. So no matter where I am, I always have the same backdrop for my podcasts. And when I move over to Australia and we get into our forever home, I will likely actually have a physical background behind me. I'm going to get these spots wallpapered onto my walls so that it, is consistent. But do pay attention to the background. Don't have washing in the background. Don't have too much clutter in the background. You just want it to be nice and consistent and not washed you out, and something that is not going to distract people as well. That would be my main recommendations there. And then the last thing I want to say about equipment is it makes a huge difference if you have a lot of soft furnishings. Now, something that I notice is when I go and stay at Airbnbs and I record a bunch of podcasts there, I'm at home at the moment, but if I'm in Airbnbs, a lot of the time they'll be tiled and they won't have a lot of furnishings in them because they're kind of minimalist when you go and stay at an Airbnb. And it's very echoey and I can tell the difference in the sound in my podcast. So where possible, I will pop a blanket on the floor around me. I'll just, grab whatever blankets there are and I'll put the blankets around me. If I'm sitting at a desk, I might pop a blanket over the desk as well. I'll bring the cushions and the soft furnishings in around me just to absorb some of that echo, and it does make quite a significant difference. Now, I know there are people who record their podcasts because they just do audio only. They're like sitting in their wardrobe if they have a walk-in wardrobe, or they're sitting on the floor of their bedroom. Or when I first started my podcast, because it was audio only, I used to go into my bed and put the blankets over my head and then just sit huddled with the blankets over my head and recording with my headphones microphone. I would hold it in front of me like this and I would just sit and say what I needed to say into my phone. And the app that I use to record audio only podcasts is literally the included voice recorder app on my iPhone. So if you are doing audio only, it definitely means you don't have to think about things like lights and using photo booth and cameras and backdrops and all those sorts of things. It's a great way to get started. I loved doing audio only podcasts because I could do them so easily. But these days I'm much more camera ready more consistently, and I do get a lot of viewership on YouTube. So that's why I have it all done at once. So I do it as a video. The audio goes onto iTunes as my podcast. The video goes onto YouTube, and then both versions are available over on my website where the show notes are. So for this episode, it's tashcorbin.com/259. So that's all of the equipment and the things that you would take into consideration when it comes to recording a podcast. Now, as I said earlier, just get started. There's nothing wrong with your first 10, 20, 30 episodes of your podcast being poorer sound quality than the next. There's nothing wrong with you starting with just a plain white wall as your background and then changing it up to having a backdrop. I got this backdrop in end of 2015. And before that, I still did YouTube videos. I still did video blogs, and wherever possible, I just had a plain white wall behind me. And if that wasn't possible, I looked for wooden tones behind me. So I tried to be consistent that way. It was either white or it was wooden, light or wooden, something along those lines. And just tried to keep a plain background behind me. And that's all I did. And it worked perfectly fine. So it doesn't need to be a fancy backdrop. You don't need to have the best of the best in order for it to be successful. The most important thing for you to do is to be consistent, especially when you're first starting out. Okay, so let's get into the content part of the podcast. How do I come up with ideas for content, and how do I turn those ideas into podcasts that do their job in my business? Well, number one is that I am consistently focusing on how do I ensure that this content is useful for my niche specifically. So you've probably heard me ranting about niche before. And if you haven't done my Nail Your Niche training yet, I'll make sure I link to it in the show notes as well. But there are often ideas that I come up with that would be great if I wasn't working with this niche. But I want to make sure I'm really focused on the people that I want to be speaking to. So I'm very clear on my niche. I'm very clear on the type of person that I want to be speaking to and helping with my podcast. And I try and stay as niched as possible. And when it comes to idea generation, I'm always collecting podcast fodder. I have an Evernote notebook that is synced between my computer and my phone. So regardless of whether I'm out and about or I'm at home at my desk, if an idea strikes me for my podcast, I have a space to go and put it. So that's definitely something that I do consistently. And I also go out proactively to find out what my audience are looking for. So I will ask questions on social media. I will pay attention to what my Takeoff students are asking on our live calls together or in the Takeoff Facebook community. When I'm doing VIP sessions with one-to-one clients, at the end of every single VIP session, I have my 5-minute post-session habit. That is also a podcast episode that I'll refer you back to. So after takeoff calls, I usually have between 12 and 20 people that I've spoken to on a takeoff call. As soon as I finish that call, I jot down what would be 5 really valuable podcast episodes based on the types of questions people are asking me in takeoff, because that's going to help me attract more of the right people who are looking for the kind of help that my takeoff students are looking for. Same with my VIP sessions. That 5-minute post-session habit gives me so much insight and information into what my audience want from me. And it helps me to keep my podcast episodes nice and tangible and practical. And it also gives me the right keywords and phrases that I need to use in order to refer to what I'm speaking about in a way that people might be Googling or it's SEO'd for my business. So number 1 is collecting the ideas and proactively seeking idea generation. So I'll ask questions in the Takeoff community. I'll ask questions on my Facebook page. I ask questions on stories. And when you're answering those questions, I'm taking note of those and popping it all into my Evernote folder where I put all of my ideas. The second step for me is to then organize and optimize those ideas into my content planner. So I have an Excel spreadsheet content planner. Everyone who does the Heart Center business planning system gets access to that as a template. We have a quarterly business planner. It has the content planner in it as one of the tabs. And so in that content planner, every few months, I will go in and take all of the ideas and I will filter them through the lens of, okay, well, in this week, what am I promoting? What am I focused on in my business? What type of content do I need to go in that week? And I'll look through all of my idea generation and I will craft a podcast title, what it would then upgrade into. So for example, if the podcast was about niche resistance, then I'd make sure that at the end of the podcast, I talked about my Nail Your Niche training. And then I also in there I will put a little note on what are the keywords that we're optimizing for in terms of SEO. So we put that I put that into my content planner and I will go through and usually I will do 12 to 20 podcast titles as I go, each time I go and look at that content planner. Now, I also do at the moment have an SEO specialist working behind the scenes in my business. So what she also does is matches up the keyword optimization that I've come up with to the keyword optimization that she's seeing in my audience and online through her Google Analytics and all of those sorts of things. So she might recommend a few little changes to podcast titles for me to ensure that it's doing the maximum it can in terms of doing its job for my business. Now, again, I only just started doing that towards the end of 2020. All the way up until then, I did not do that with my podcast. I just came up with what I thought was going to be interesting and insightful for my audience. And that was more than enough for me to get started. I'm not recommending that you go out and get your podcast titles optimized. You have to do that in order to be successful. No, not at all. It is just, I want to be upfront with you that it is something that I'm doing at the moment just to get in that practice and kind of work out where I might be missing the mark with a lot of my podcast titles and those sorts of things anyway. So organize it into when I'm going to be releasing that podcast. I put it so that it's aligned with what I'm launching at that point in time and optimizing for the right keywords and what category it's going to go to in my podcast, those sorts of things. So organizing and optimizing is step 2 of my content planning. Now, that is where I'm paying attention to what job I want that podcast episode to do. So I like to make sure there's a balance in podcast episodes between podcasts that are for reach, podcasts that are for nurturing, and podcasts that are for active lead generation. So I'm not always creating podcasts that only work for a cold audience. I'm not always creating podcasts that only work for a warm audience. I'm mixing it up and making sure that I'm hitting all those different jobs that podcast episodes need to do for my business. Once again, if you want to learn out how to get your content to do its job and you want to go deeper on this, I recommend after you've finished listening to this podcast episode, go to the show notes at tashcorbin.com/259 and grab the link to the How to Get Your Content to Do Its Job podcast episode. It's a really good one. The third step then is to start recording podcasts. So what I do is I have a recording day, and on my recording day, I will usually aim to record 5 or 6 podcasts in a day. And so the first thing that I do is I actually create the Post-it note for that podcast episode. So I'm going to show you a little bit behind the scenes here. So this is from a previous podcast episode. I love this size of Post-it. So I think it's the 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter Post-it note. And what I do is I write the podcast episode number up the top. So this one was for episode number 257. I put the title of the podcast episode, and then you can see it's just a few dot points. Like, it's really not a lot of information, but it is enough to guide me on what I need to make sure I cover in that episode, and I can talk about it from there. It's very easy for me to speak about my content. I've practiced this a lot. Go and look for my earliest videos on YouTube. You'll know that this doesn't come naturally to me. This has come from practice. But I don't like to have like a full-on script for my podcast because I find it's not as conversational, it's not as connected, and it's not often my voice. So I use that Post-it note to just give me the information, the key pieces of information that I need to be able to record that podcast episode confidently. And then I literally stick it over my face when I'm recording on a photo booth. So right now, I can't see my face on my screen. All I can see is my Post-it note. So I have my Post-it note for this episode right in front of me now, and it's got these key points for me so that I can refer back to them. So I have my recording day. I sit down, I write out the Post-it notes for every episode. So I'm doing a batch now, of course. So I've got different Post-it notes. I haven't written the notes for this one yet. This is the one I'll be doing next. So I have a Post-it note for each episode, and I'll have 3 or 4 of them in front of me at a time, and I'll just go through 1, 2, 3, 4, record 4 podcast episodes, and I've done. So a really efficient way for me to batch things up, but not put pressure on myself to have to do 30 at once. I once got very inspired by Denise Duffield-Thomas. She had a year, I think it was like 2016. It was quite a long time ago, where she recorded 52 podcast episodes in one recording session. That's just Munchkin having a scratch. We'll just ignore her for now. She recorded 52 podcast episodes in one session. And I think it took her 2 days or 3 days to do it with a video recorder. And then she'd batched everything up for the year. And I just put this pressure on myself. I need to record at least 20 episodes at once, because if Denise can do it, I can do it. But what I find is that I get a little low in energy by the end of doing these podcast episodes. And for me, the magic number seems to be 6. If I do 6 episodes in a day, like that feels like I'm really stretching myself. but I'm still bright and bubbly on the 6th of those podcast episodes. So yeah, for me, it's about 6 episodes at a time. You may know I go away on a solo retreat every few months in my business, and it's usually on those retreats that I do the majority of my podcast recording anyway. I'm on my own. There's no munchkin scratching in the background like she just did on this episode because I'm at home at the moment. And also I'm just in a different space, and there's a real different energy to it. I really get into the creative space. I do actually do a lot of work on opening up my sacral chakra, lots of walking, lots of yoga, those sorts of things, getting into that creative zone. I burn a beautiful candle. So I get really into this amazing content creation space when I am on retreat. Generally, when I'm on retreat, if I go for 5 days, I'll be able to record at least 12, sometimes even 15 episodes of the podcast. And then I also set myself a little challenge of recording 50 to 100 short, sharp videos that aren't podcast episodes. I'll talk about that on another podcast. But yeah, I find the magic number for me is about 6 podcast episodes in a day. And if I have a busy day, I love squeezing podcast episodes in between sessions with clients. Really fun way to just get it done throughout the day and feel like I'm staying in that customer focus zone or something. Yeah, really great way of doing it for me. So I record it, and then I pop it up into my team's Dropbox, which is for all the podcasts that need to be edited. Every time I record a podcast episode, I also take a little photo that will go with that podcast episode to help my team. And then my team takes over. So my team then take this, they edit the video if necessary. I try and do all my podcasts in one take, but sometimes Munchkin will bark or something will happen. I'll have a sneezing fit or something. So I'll always take note of what time in the recording that happened. And then when I pop it in the Dropbox to my team, I'll just message Dee Dee from my team and say, hey, at 25 minutes, Munchkin barked at something. So you'll have to edit that little bit out. But usually I try and get it done in one take. So they edit up just by popping the intro music at the start, the outro music at the end, just trimming the front and back of it. They turn it into the audio file as well for the podcast. So the video goes up onto YouTube. The audio goes up onto Libsyn. Libsyn is the podcast tool that I use. There's lots of them, but Libsyn is the one that I use, Libsyn. It costs me about $20 a month now, I think, and it's been the one that I've used from the start. From Libsyn, they push it over to iTunes and Spotify and all those other places for you. So it's a really great tool for me, really good reporting on it, really cost effective as well. So I like Libsyn. My team also grab the transcript of it and they use an auto transcripting tool and then tidy it up. And then I have a copywriter on my team who tidies up the written transcript into more of a well-written article and makes sure that it's got good readability and well SEO'd for that keyword or that key phrase that we chose in the content planner. My team then schedule it up to be released on all platforms. So I try and get it released on the same day at the same time in all the different spaces. So get it up on YouTube and onto iTunes and Spotify and the post on my website all going out at the same time. And then also my team does the distribution of that podcast for me. So that person also puts an excerpt into the newsletter for the week that it's supposed to go out, creates some promo posts for it for my Facebook page, and then schedules those promo posts up to go out 3 or 4 times after I've done that episode. So there'll be the release date post on my Facebook page, then a few weeks after that, then a month or so after that, and then 2 months after that. I used to get them to schedule it up 6 or 7 times, but I have found recently with the Facebook algorithm favoring less posts per day on pages that we've brought that back a little. So now it doesn't get shared quite as many times on Facebook on my page, but it does get shared in a few other places. Now, one thing I have been experimenting with recently is when the podcast episode goes live, I also do some distribution. So it doesn't just go to my list and then onto my Facebook page now. I will also post about it in stories, Instagram stories, Facebook stories. I will do a few little chatty short videos to explain why this would be a great podcast episode to check out. And those videos might go on my page, into the Heart-Centered community, onto Instagram, or into stories as well. That's something I'm experimenting with at the moment, but I do find it does improve listenership every time I do it. So I will continue to take a little bit more of a front seat with distributing my podcast beyond those more structured ways that my team do it for me, just to see if we can increase the number of listeners that come along and join us. Now, this is where my podcast does its job for income generation. Because I've created the podcast in a way where it's aligned to what I'm launching and promoting at that point in time, it's niched to the right audience, it has a call to action that's going to be easy for my audience to take, and it's distributed far and wide in the ways that it needs to be distributed, then it does its job of maximizing the return on investment for my business and generating income, because that means that my podcast is reaching new audiences, nurturing my existing audience, generating leads and people jumping onto my mailing list, grabbing those freebies or buying the 30-day business blast, or even coming to conference if I'm promoting conference. And it's increasing the extent to which people know me, like me, trust me, feel connected to me. And so it's positioning me as someone who knows what I'm talking about when it comes to business. And when people find out about my programs or how they might be able to work with me, they are way more likely to invest if they are a podcast listener. So it's not like I record a podcast and then I go out and try and get it to generate income for me. The entire way through that process, I'm thinking about what job does this podcast episode need to do, and how can I build it and distribute it in a way that it is going to do that job effectively. So if you are interested in podcasting, or if you already have a podcast, I hope that you have found this episode really juicy and helpful. I'm sure that you're going to have one or two questions for me. So what I'd love to invite you to do is to come on over to the Heart-Centered Soul-Driven Entrepreneurs Facebook group, use the hashtag podcastaha, and let me know you've been listening to episode number 259. And you are welcome to ask me any questions that you have about my podcast, what I do behind the scenes, or what you need to do in order to get your podcast working for your business as well. Now, I've shared a lot of little tips and hints and tools for you in this podcast episode as well. So remember to come over to the show notes at tashcorbin.com/259. And in the transcript of this podcast episode will be links to the equipment I recommended, the other podcast episodes I've referred to, and also some of those freebies and courses that I have noted that I offer in order to help support you to grow your business. So if you want to go and check it all out, you'll also have that very easy to follow stepped out written version of this podcast episode. So make sure you come over to tashcorbin.com/259 and check it all out. And as I said, if you've got any questions, you can ask them in the Heart-Centered Soul-Driven Entrepreneurs Facebook group. Thank you so much for joining me for this extended episode of the Heart-Centered Business Podcast. I hope you found it super helpful. And until next time, I cannot wait to see you shine. Bye for now. Would you like more tips, tools, and resources to help you grow your heart-centered business? Head to tashcorbin.com today.